All right, guys, so this is going to be the second part of the brain lab. So we're going to be looking at the brain now, right? So this is the looking down on the brain, anterior, posterior. So we can see here that this is going to be the cerebrum. We have this fissure right here that is dividing the brain into right and left hemispheres. So it's called the longitudinal fissure right here. And it's a pretty deep fissure, and that's kind of, you should be able to pull the hemispheres apart a little bit. We can see in the front, these are the frontal lobes, so you have one in each hemisphere, the parietal lobes, one in each hemisphere, and the occipital lobes are in the back, one in each hemisphere. And the temporal lobe you cannot see on that picture because it's a little bit lower. We'll see it on the lateral view in just a second. And the insular lobe is not visible at the surface, but I'll show you where it is in just a bit. So the frontal lobe is going to be this guy right here, and it is going to come up here to this central sulcus, so that's one you need to know. And this gyrus that's right in front of the central sulcus is called the precentral gyrus. And we'll talk about this in lecture. It's where we have our primary motor cortex, but we'll need to identify the precentral gyrus. And so this is the frontal lobe. The parietal lobe is right behind it, and it's going to be right behind the central sulcus. And so this parietal lobe, this first gyrus here is called the postcentral gyrus. So it's right next to the central sulcus. The functions, we're not going to talk too much, but the functions of the frontal lobe are mostly motor, as well as like decision-making, planning, and things like that. Whereas the functions of the parietal lobe are going to be somatosensation, so like body sensation, pain, pressure, and sense of touch. The temporal lobe is going to be right below the parietal and frontal lobes. And so, here's a good picture. Let me go way back up here. Sorry, didn't realize there wasn't a good picture of where the temporal lobe is. So this is the temporal lobe right here. So we've got frontal up here, then parietal, and now temporal. So the temporal lobe is going to be right below this lateral sulcus. And the temporal lobe has both auditory, so hearing functions, as well as smelling functions. Now, the insular lobe is actually going to be right here. So if we opened up the lateral sulcus, and you can do this on some of the models, and there's some pictures and some videos that you can see that, then the insular lobe is going to be right under deep to this lateral sulcus. In the back here, we have the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is going to be primarily, back to the insular lobe, it has to do with taste. Now, the occipital lobe has to do with vision. Those are kind of the main things you need to know for the cerebrum. Remember that the sulci are going to be the valleys, and the gyrus are the hills, or the gyri are the hills. All right, so here's the lobes. Now, moving on to the diencephalon, this is the middle part of the brain, and the diencephalon is going to include everything that has thalamus in the name. So the epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. And so the epithalamus, the main thing to know about the epithalamus is the pineal gland. So it's this little guy right here, and that's going to secrete melatonin, which is important for circadian rhythms. The thalamus, we can see it's kind of this dark area here, this brownish area. This is the interthalamic adhesion, so it's going to kind of pierce through the third ventricle, and you actually have the thalamus is really big, but you can't see much on midline because in midline, it only has that tiny little interthalamic adhesion. So there's actually some big thalamic bodies on either side. We just can't see it as well on midline. This is sort of part of it. The third ventricle is right on midline. So this area here that's outlined in purple is where the third ventricle would be. So we would kind of be cutting through the area where the third ventricle is. Now, the hypothalamus is down here. So the hypothalamus is below the thalamus, and it's going to be continuous. It has the stalk. It's called the infundibulum, and it's attached up to the pituitary gland. So this hypothalamus is going to be, has lots of functions, and we'll talk more about those in lecture. So this part I said, remember that the thalamus actually is really large. We just can't see it as well on that that mid-sagittal view. And the interthalamic adhesion is where these two large lobes are going to be attached. You don't need to be able to know all of these different parts, just be able to say thalamus. The brainstem is going to connect the cerebrum, diencephalon, and cerebellum to the spinal cord. It contains both ascending sensory tracts and descending motor tracts. So these are like axons going to the brain or away from the brain. And we'll talk more about that with the spinal cord. It contains a lot of autonomic nuclei. So these are nuclei are going to be groups of brain cells, groups of cell bodies of the autonomic nervous system. It also has groups of cell bodies that are connected to cranial nerves, and we'll learn about cranial nerves next lab or so, and some reflex centers, mostly for homeostasis maintaining. The midbrain, pons, and medulla are the three parts that you need to know. So the thalamus is up here. So you have a model that looks just like this. The thalamus is on top. Below that is the midbrain. And these mammillary bodies right here, these actually are extensions that kind of come out of the side of the hypothalamus, but we can see them right here on the midbrain. So there's paired mammillary bodies. Right above it is going to be the infundibulum. So this would be connected to the pituitary gland. So those are things to be able to identify. This part right here is the pons, and then this is the medulla oblongata. And these two things right on the anterior surface of the medulla oblongata are the pyramids. And right here, the decussation of the pyramids is lots. Remember, or we will mention in lecture, that the left side of the brain is going to control the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. So most of these motor tracks cross, and right here is where a lot of these axons cross at the decussation of the pyramids. Now, if we look at the back, so this was the anterior view, this is going to be the posterior lateral view, so this is the back. We can see that this part right here is the thalamus is still up here. This is the pineal gland, and we saw that sort of on midline. Now, these guys right here, this is the tectile plate, or the corpora quadrigemina as a whole. So the top two are the superior colliculi, and the bottom two are the inferior colliculi. You could just call them the tectile plate. That'll probably be the easiest thing, and we'll mention a little bit more about their functions in lecture. So this is kind of the back part of the pons, and then here's the back part of the medulla oblongata. So those are the main things to be able to identify for So the cerebellum is going to be that little tiny brain. It's at the back. It's going to be, just like the cerebrum, it has an outer cortex of gray matter and an inner sort of white matter. And it also has right and left cerebellar hemispheres. And it's going to be in between, so at the back of your head, you have the cerebellum and cerebrum, and there's a transverse fissure that goes right in between them that is going to be connecting them. So the major regions that you'll need to be able to identify are the cerebellar cortex, which is the outer gray matter, and the arbor vitae, which is the internal white matter. So this is right here, this is the cerebellar cortex. So this is the gray matter on the outside, and then this white part right here that looks like a tree, or the tree of life, the arbor vitae, this is the white matter. And you can see the two different cerebellar hemispheres. You don't really need to know about the lobes or the vermis. Right. So I'm going to really quickly go into APR and into your down here to see a couple other things that you can look at. You can practice labeling the brain. There are these really cool widgets that Dr. Yates made. So this is a little widget of the meninges that you guys can look at that's labeled. You've also got a brain widget that you guys can look at and labeled, so you can kind of move them around. This is cool since we don't have the actual hands-on models right now. And so you can turn it around, move it around, and here, let me move this. You can see that there are a bunch of different options. You can show labels, hide labels. You can open the Explorer tools. You can fade or hide different pieces. So you can kind of look and see and move things around. You can see the ventricles, you can see different areas. So this is a pretty cool little thing to look at, just a little widget to play with. This is just a GIF of the ventricles that you guys can look at. This is that's where the cerebrospinal fluid would be inside the brain. And then these are going to be really helpful, these pictures right here, labeling your brain models. So you can see these are the brain models we would have looked at in class. And I've got lots of videos of brains that you guys can look at down here, as well as some of the different lobes here. So I should hopefully have gone through mostly everything. I do want to go into your APR revealed. Oh, got to relog in. So if you go into APR revealed, there's a couple of things you guys can look at. So if you go to the nervous module here, maybe. Hello. There we go. All right, so we're going to go to module, we're going to go to nervous. And so now for here, you would look at brain. And you can look at the lateral view, maybe the brain. And so I usually like to just go through and click the different layers so we can see, oh, this is the dura mater on top of the brain. And then we can go here and we can see the brain and you can see the different cerebral hemispheres. It's working really slow today. The lateral sulcus. We can see the deep parts of the brain in here too. The midbrain, cerebral aqueduct, third ventricle, thalamus. Usually when you highlight it and click it, yeah, there we go. It should highlight. It's just really slow today. So you can look through this. This will be really helpful, I think. And it also tells you the location, the function. The other thing you can do is now the new thing they've added is regional anatomy. So they've added some regional anatomy, and go to all content. Make sure, since I have not customized any of this yet, it's pretty new. And I think that the only regional anatomy they have so far is the head and neck. But either way, that's where the brain is located, so we can look at that there. This one it's like a 3D view, so we can look all around at it. And because of that, it takes a little longer to load. So we're going to be looking mostly at the nervous system. So you can say this right here, this is visible, this is like transparent, and this is gone. So you can make things transparent. Well, not the nervous system. So you could make everything transparent if you wanted to. I'm going to say let's just get rid of the muscles and let's get rid of the cardiovascular. And if we want, we can make the skeletal transparent just so we can kind of, you know, keep our orientation here. So we can look through and you can move the brain around and look at it. And if you open up the nervous system here, we can talk about the lobes of the cerebrum. So we can find the frontal lobe, move it around, the occipital lobe, move it around, parietal, temporal. So that's really neat, I think. You can see a lot right there. The cerebellum, we can see the thalamus. We can't really see the thalamus very well. So let's go through and let's make the lobes of the cerebrum. Let's get rid of the bones. We'll get rid of this. And so now we can just look here. So this is just going to be the thalamus and the brainstem. We can also see, so here's the thalamus. And let's see, somewhere, hypothalamus. And we might have to look on midline. Let's see. View, anterior, posterior. All right, well, we can move the view around. I'm going to turn the spinal cord off for now because we don't need that. All right, so the ventricles. I don't think it's highlighting properly. I'm going to turn the ventricles off, but we should be able to see. So the amygdala, oh, here it is, it's highlighting now. Amygdala is one that you guys, we talk about. The mammillary bodies, it should be, yep, they're right in there, the mammillary bodies. Let's see, the hypothalamus, it should be right above there. The hypothalamus is going to be on midline, you can't see it very well. Oh, I think it's might be highlighting in there. That should be the pineal gland, which would be the brainstem and endocrine gland. So that's the pineal gland back there. So this should be your tectile plate somewhere. It's in the midbrain, so your tectile plate is back there. So there's a lot of cool stuff that you can see on here. Your cranial nerves, I'm going to turn them off right now. We are going to be looking at the cranial nerves, but not in this lab. And we can also zoom in, we can zoom out. So this, I think, is really pretty cool. Let's see, we can remove the thalamus, maybe, and we can go through here, the brainstem. Oh, we can make the brainstem a little bit see-through. So you can do a lot of cool stuff in here. I do think that it's really cool that you can kind of see how the ventricles wrap around the brainstem, and that kind of helps a lot. So this one is not as useful because I don't really think I can see a way to look at it from the inside, but we can definitely see a lot from the outside. And I haven't played with this enough to really see if I can view, if I could cut it on like a sagittal section. But we can go back and add everything back, and then you can see like a whole bunch of the head. So that's a pretty cool one we can look through. So don't forget to use APR. APR is a really good resource, especially since we don't have access to the models right now, since we're quarantined.